We're so glad that you are here tonight and you have prioritized being at this event toward a nuclear weapons-free world: ethics, social justice, and civil society activism. Welcome. We're organized by the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, specifically the Peace and Security Committee with the International Law Committee, as well as All Souls Church Unitarian of Washington, D.C. As the chair of the board of directors of UNA-NCA, as we call it, I'm glad you've made time tonight. It's going to be a very rich experience. When I think about toward a nuclear weapons-free world, I think back to my undergraduate days, University of Massachusetts. I met Phyllis. Yeah, she was pursuing her master's degree. She was in her 70s. Her dissertation and her focus, future studies. When I started probing around the edges about why, what I learned was that in 1945, she was a reporter. She was working for CBS, sent to Hiroshima after the bomb had dropped. That was 76 years ago. I was inspired by what she told me in the 1980s. And I think about her now. She understood, like so many of us do, that we're interconnected. Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King said, an inescapable network of mutuality tied into a single garment of destiny. That's who we are. Or as Unitarians tend to say it, we respect the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So today we reflect on the power of citizens, civil society, including faith organizations, as we work through the United Nations and with the United Nations, in making change that serves everyone. The United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, part of, in fact, the national UNA, has 1,100 members within the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. We prioritize advocacy. Obviously, there is a congressional focus of funding of the United Nations and its agencies, the Sustainable Development Goals, and an initiative on global to local, taking those 17 goals and looking at what they mean in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, and DC for CEDAW. And with that, in fact, it is how to take the Treaty on the Human Rights of Women and ensure that it's, in fact, encoded within local government and practice. We have fellows that do research writing and lobbying. We do outreach, building networks and partnerships like today's with All Souls, but also then with UN agencies who are based in Washington, D.C., especially the International Labor Organization, the IOM handling migration, PAHO handling Pan American Health, supporting with community funds of the World Bank and IMF, US Institute for Peace, and many other organizations, universities, and faith organizations. So we're glad to be here with All Souls tonight. We also do education, global classrooms. And with that, the focus is, in fact, Model UN and other activities for middle and high school students to bring the UN to them so that they understand the power of the many agencies and what we as Americans can do within it. Our Graduate Fellows Program supports local university students who are doing their master's and their doctoral degrees. Again, bringing a keen eye to the United Nations and how we are a part of it. UNA-NCA is volunteer-led through our board and our many committees, and we have a very small, impactful staff. Definitely, we punch above our weight. We welcome your involvement. If you're not a member yet, well, absolutely, we invite you. And or two, why not be a sponsor? In the chat, we'll put the web address and information on ways you can engage in UNA-NCA. Thanks again for prioritizing this location tonight with us. It's going to be powerful. I turn it over now to Patrick Realisa, who's our dynamic co-chair of UNA-NCA's Peace and Security Committee. Patrick, it's yours.
Thank you, Jill, for those opening remarks. My name is Patrick Realisa, and I serve as the co-chair of the Peace and Security Committee for the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, or UNA-NCA. The UNA-NCA Peace and Security Committee is dedicated to promoting the core principles of the UN conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and peacebuilding efforts. Through a series of innovative programs and events, our committee is aimed at elevating the awareness of past, present, and future initiatives while working to develop relevant policy recommendations to further strengthen the United States' key role in supporting UN collective security efforts. On behalf of the UNA-NCA Peace and Security Committee, I'd like to once again personally extend a warm welcome to all of you watching online. In continuing with today's program, I have the sincere privilege of introducing our next speaker, Reverend Rob Keaton of the All Souls Unitarian Church here in Washington, D.C. As the Minister of Social Justice, Reverend Keaton supports the church's many issue groups, works to bring effectiveness and spiritual depth to the social justice ministry. Beyond All Souls, Reverend Keaton serves as a consultant specializing in counter-oppressive transformation, congregational social justice programs, and long-term cultural change. Recent clients have included the Center for American Progress and the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Previously, Reverend Keaton served as a consulting minister at 2 Unitarian Universalist congregations and as a director of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations Washington office. He is a graduate of the Wesley Theological Seminary. Reverend Keaton, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the partnership on this very important event. I am honored to be part of this program and say a little about All Souls' past and present work in this arena. All Souls will celebrate our 200th anniversary this November, and we have a long history of working for social justice in our city, our nation, and our world. And while some of our work is locally or nationally focused, issues such as the climate crisis, immigration justice, and certainly nuclear disarmament have a global scope. And during the pandemic, we have been reminded that we are a global church, and it's been really fun to see members and friends participate in our services from all over the world. Now, this coming Friday, August 6th, will mark 76 years since the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, not far from Hankawa Elementary School. And at the end of World War II, All Souls minister, the Reverend A. Powell Davies, became a leader on the issue of civilian control of atomic energy. And he preached very forcefully on the inhumanity and evil of dropping the atomic bomb. And in 1946, a sermon of his entitled "Lest the Living Forget" eventually led to the children and families of All Souls donating school supplies and art supplies to the Hankawa School, which led to what we now know as the Hiroshima Children's Drawings. You saw some of them earlier. They are remarkably positive, a reminder of both the power of art and the power of children to cultivate joy and hope in the toughest conditions. In 2005, a Hiroshima Children's Drawings Committee formed at All Soul to restore and preserve them, but also to tell the story and to use them to encourage peace and reconciliation in our time. And a delegation from All Souls traveled to Hiroshima in 2010 to host an exhibition of the drawings at the Hankawa Elementary School, where we reunited those drawings with as many of the students who made them as we could find. And as you can imagine, it was an incredible experience for all who were involved. And we're grateful that it's been captured in a documentary film called Pictures from a Hiroshima Schoolyard. And that film will air on Maryland Public Television at 10 p.m. This coming Thursday, August 5th. But you can also buy it for home viewing at hiroshimaschoolyard.com. I will warn you that there are some very graphic images, so it's not good, probably not suitable for younger children, but middle school and above, probably. Following that trip, All Souls created an ongoing peace initiative in line with our denomination's adoption of a statement of conscience on creating peace. And we entered into a peace exchange program with the Risho Kosakai, a Buddhist organization in Japan. And this exchange program is based on a belief that peace must be nurtured through mutual understanding and common compassion, and that we We want to continue to build on that realization by directly strengthening relationships between the citizens of the US and Japan. And to date, over 50 All Souls members have traveled to Hiroshima, and a corresponding number of our Japanese partners have come to Washington. And in these cross-national gatherings, we've stood at the Hankawa School looking at the drawings together. And we've also stood literally under the Enola Gay at the Udvar Hazy Center and prayed together. And this partnership, the longstanding collaboration with the local Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee on annual visuals, the emerging partnership with the UNA of the National Capital Area, these are vital to generating energy and momentum for the ongoing work of peace and reconciliation, as well as the new challenges that we face: the climate crisis, challenging racism and white supremacy, striving for LGBT equality, ensuring access to reproductive health care, and so much more. Now, in closing, I want to invite us to engage in just a simple, short act to help ground us in our bodies and our shared work. So I invite you to just get comfortable where you are, and let's each of us take 3 centering breaths. One for the past, one for the present, and one for the future. So let's breathe together. May our combined efforts spread love and liberation throughout our world. Thanks. May it be so.
Good evening. I'm Chuck Woldridge of All Souls Church. I am the chair of our Heiwa Peace Project. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Rene Holbach. Rene Holbach is a program management officer in the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch of the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, where he focuses on nuclear disarmament. Before joining UNODA, Mr. Holbach worked in the Secretariat of the General Assembly. Previously, he worked on issues related to international criminal justice and United Nations reform for the permanent mission of Liechtenstein to the United Nations, as well as for the International Criminal Court. Mr. Holbach holds a Master of Philosophy in International Relations from the University of Cambridge and a Bachelor of Arts in Modern History and Politics from Royal Holloway, University of London. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rene Holbach.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Mr. Woolridge. Ms. Christensen, Reverend Keaton, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to represent the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs at this event. The anniversaries of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are a key moment to reflect on the history of nuclear disarmament and to think about our future steps. The United Nations and the nuclear age were born almost at the same time. Less than half a year elapsed between the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the first meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. It is no wonder then that nuclear weapons would be foremost on the minds of the diplomats meeting in London in January 1946. Indeed, the very first resolution adopted by the General Assembly established a commission tasked to make proposals for the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons. The devastation that a single nuclear weapon wrought on both of these cities continues to shock us to this day. The fact that over 13,000 nuclear warheads remain in arsenals today, many of them substantially more powerful than those used 76 years ago, underscores why nuclear disarmament is not some airy fantasy, but indeed an urgent necessity. That is why Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, has repeatedly emphasized that the total elimination of nuclear weapons remains the United Nations' highest disarmament priority. While achieving nuclear disarmament is certainly an ethical imperative, as the title of this event suggests, it is also in the security interests of all states. Civil society engagement with nuclear weapons and advocacy for their abolition goes back decades and has always been linked with multilateral diplomacy. The largest anti-nuclear protest in the history of the United States, for example, took place in New York on the 12th of June, 1982, in connection with the second special session of the United Nations General Assembly on disarmament. The voices of civil society continue to form an important part of United Nations conversations on disarmament to this day. At the United Nations today, our work on nuclear weapons is shaped by the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, which remains the centerpiece of the global regime to achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons. Adopted in 1968, the NPT is based on the realization that while the total elimination of nuclear weapons remains the goal, it is in the interest of all states to prevent the spread of these weapons in the meantime. The treaty recognizes 5 nuclear weapon states: China, France, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These states undertake not to transfer nuclear weapons or to assist in the manufacture of nuclear weapons in any state. All other states are non-nuclear weapon states, and they undertake not to acquire nuclear weapons and to submit their peaceful nuclear programs to safeguards administered by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, despite its name, the NPT is about more than non-proliferation. In its Article 6, the treaty contains an obligation to pursue in good faith negotiations on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. This legal obligation is binding on nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states alike and constitutes the only such obligation entered into by nearly all states. The treaty's role in the pursuit of the elimination of nuclear weapons was strengthened when the NPT was indefinitely extended in 1995. Since then, its quinquennial review conferences have become de facto nuclear disarmament negotiating fora. Through the negotiation of outcome documents, though the negotiation of outcome documents ultimately takes place between states, large numbers of civil society representatives regularly participate in NPT meetings and, through formal interventions, informal conversations with diplomats and side events, make known their views to the states' parties. These review conferences have produced important outcome documents. The 13 practical steps adopted at the 2000 review conference and the 64-point action plan adopted in 2010 contain a commitment to the total elimination of nuclear weapons, which is a phrase that you've heard me say a couple of times already, as well as concrete steps to achieve that goal. These commitments remain valid today, and the Secretary General of the United Nations has called for their implementation. The 2010 review conference also expressed its deep concern at the continued risk for humanity represented by the possibility that these weapons could be used and the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result from the use of nuclear weapons. And here we get into the ethical imperatives part of today's meeting. This kicked off a years-long diplomatic effort by civil society and like-minded states to highlight the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And it ultimately led to the negotiation and adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, in 2017. Before I turn to that treaty, I think it's useful to expand a little bit further on what the phrase, the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, entails. Nuclear weapons are the only weapons that have the potential to end all life on this planet. Many states believe that their effects cannot be restricted in either time or space to lawful military targets. The International Committee of the Red Cross has warned that a nuclear bomb detonated on a city would immediately kill tens of thousands of people, and tens of thousands more would suffer horrific injuries and die later from radiation exposure. Health and emergency services would not be able to cope with this catastrophe. In addition to the immense short-term loss of life, a nuclear war could cause long-term damage to our planet. It could severely disrupt the Earth's ecosystem and reduce global temperatures, resulting in food shortages around the world. A series of 3 conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons served to raise awareness among states of these uncomfortable truths about nuclear weapons. It convinced many states of the necessity to take urgent action to prohibit them, especially in the face of continued slow progress by the states that possess nuclear weapons to achieve such an outcome. Civil society, and particularly the Hibakusha, or survivors of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, played a key part in driving forward the discussion that ultimately resulted in the negotiation of the TPNW. Through the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, civil society worked hand in glove with a coalition of states driving this process. The key role of civil society was recognized with the awarding of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize to ICAN. So what does this treaty, the TPNW, actually say? It contains a comprehensive set of prohibitions on participating in any nuclear weapons-related activities. States parties are required to take all appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited to a state party under this treaty, undertaken on their territory or by persons under their jurisdiction or control. The TPNW requires states parties to assist individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons, as well as to take environmental remediation measures in areas under their jurisdiction or control that have been contaminated due to the testing or use of nuclear weapons. States parties are also required to cooperate with one another to facilitate the implementation of this treaty. The TPNW entered into force earlier this year on the 22nd of January 2021. For its 55 states parties, the provisions of the treaty that I just outlined are now the force of law. The coming years will be important as states parties take institutional decisions on the implementation of the treaty and work to ensure that the TPNW has a role within the international disarmament structure that is complementary and supportive of the NPT and other landmark treaties. Based on their positive experience with the process leading to the NPT's adoption, states parties are keen to ensure that the voice of civil society will be heard at future meetings of states parties to the treaty. The next year will bring with it crucial opportunities to make progress towards a world free of nuclear weapons. The postponed 10th NPT Review Conference and the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW will both take place in early 2022. The Office for Disarmament Affairs will support the states parties to both treaties towards the achievement of a positive outcome. Nuclear disarmament remains an urgent necessity. While the role of governments continues to be crucial, civil society organizations, like today's co-hosts, are also key to raising public awareness and advocating for progress. The United Nations will continue to work with all partners to make progress towards our shared goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Renee, for your powerful keynote message. Once again, we appreciate your participation at today's program on behalf of the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs and look forward to continuing the dialogue through our panel discussion shortly. Before I officially introduce our moderators, I'd like to take the time to kindly remind our audience today to please use the chat feature in Zoom to submit your questions throughout the panel discussion. This is located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to get through as many questions as possible. Furthermore, we ask that you briefly identify yourself and affiliations upon submitting your questions. And now, without further ado, it is now my sincere pleasure and honor to introduce our two distinguished moderators for this evening's panel discussion, beginning with Mr. Mel Hardy. Mel is an educator, an arts, culture, and humanities advocate, and is a member of the Association for Fundraising Professionals. He is a graduate of Columbia University School of International Affairs and was a Ralph Bunche Fellow of the UN Foundation, which supported his thesis work in East Africa. He also completed a certificate at the Institute of African Studies at Columbia and was its International Fellows Program. At All Souls Church, he serves on the curatorial team for the Hiroshima Children's Drawing and is a director of the Social Justice Endowment Fund at the church. He is on the advisory board of UNA-NCA and is an active member of our Peace and Security Committee. Next, we have Ms. Karen Mulhauser, who is a UNA-NCA past president and UNA USA past National Council Chair. Karen is the president of Mulhauser and Associates and has been consulting for nonprofit organizations, grant makers, and candidates since 1988. She brings years of leadership experience as CEO of 3 nonprofits and as a board member of over 35 domestic and international nonprofits. Karen was the executive director of NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, the Center for Education on Nuclear War, and Citizens Against Nuclear War. She founded the nonprofit America's Impact to help elect candidates to Congress with principled foreign policy positions, coordinates with consulting women, a network of 830 DC area self-employed women, has chaired the advisory council of the Women's Information Network, or WIN, and has worked on several congressional and presidential campaigns. Karen and Mel, please take it away.
Mel, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and I'm delighted to be associated with both institutions, both the All Souls Church and the United Nations Association. Having listened to Reverend Keaton and his remarks around the issues of peace and reconciliation and the cross-national gatherings that have been held with our Japanese partners and associates, and having listened to Renee Holbach's keynote, I introduce to our audience consideration of the theological, moral, and ethical questions associated with holding of nuclear weapons, their development, and in this age, small arms deployment with spent fuel, modernization, and so many other aspects of the nuclear weapons ecosystem today. All such questions are fashioned under the context of what Mr. Holbach has just mentioned, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and 90 days later, its entry into force as international law. I also want to lift this matter of just war theory, the Augustinian principle, which was adhered to by so many in our communities of faith for so very long. Within this year, on October 3rd of 2020, Pope Francis issued what might be considered a new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, kind of calling back St. Francis's admonition to us to be in community, brother and sister across, to actually reconsider, to have the Roman Catholic Church to reconsider so many aspects of just war theory, and perhaps to lead to what Marie Dennis of Pax Christi might refer to as just peace. So with that, please allow me to have our panel consider that, and please, Karen, allow me to pass it to you.
Okay, well, it's an honor to be with all of you this evening, and this is an issue that has been seriously important to me for many years. It was mentioned in the introduction that I once led a couple of disarmament organizations, which allowed me to do some amazing things, including organizing a 2-day conference that dealt with these same issues back in 1983, and also in 1985 to bring a delegation of 35 US women to Geneva for the first summit meeting between President Reagan and Prime Minister Gorbachev. So, and many, many other things. So it's an issue that I've cared about deeply. The portion of the program that I'm going to be moderating will be dealing with issues of advocacy or education or civic action that can bring about change. Mel is going to be moderating the portion to address the issues, the ethical and social justice issues. And then after that, the panelists will be able to share their ideas about what is effective advocacy to bring about change. And so Mel, do you want to introduce the panelists? And you're mute.
Our panelists will include Renee Holbach, from whom you've heard already, and Bruce Knotts, who is the Unitarian Universalist representative to the United Nations. And he sits on so many worldwide committees at that intersection of matters of faith and geopolitical affairs in his work at the UN. In addition to that, we have one of our colleagues from Japan, Hiroyo Murayama from Religions for Peace, who will also provide commentary from her perspective. Now, she's 13 hours away, but she has generously allowed herself to grace us with her own special lens and acumen on these matters. So with that, I'll just kind of look at the overarching question about the morality, the theological underpinnings, perhaps, and to help us in the audience to understand why do we need these things we call nuclear weapons? Why is there so much zeal to have them? And what is it that might, for those of us who are looking at the ethics of them, to encourage how we should join coalitions to prohibit them, their use, their holdings?
If I can jump in to begin with, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. In addition to representing the UUA at the UN, I also am a co-moderator of Religions for Peace USA. So I'm very glad to have my colleague here from Japan, Religions for Peace. And the Pope has said that the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. And I agree with that. And also, these are weapons that cannot be used. They cannot be used. If they are ever used, the life on our planet ends. So they can't be used. And we're spending billions, trillions of dollars on huge weapon systems that if they're ever used, it's the end of us as a people. And I'll go a step further. If missiles were to be launched against the United States, would it be moral for us to retaliate? And I would say no, it is not. It's preferable that if some people can survive, it's better to have them survive. If two great nations, say Russia and the United States, were to enter a nuclear war with each other, we end life on this planet, all life, plants, animals, all life. It can't be more immoral than that. So these are weapons we should not own, should never use, they cannot be used. And the morality to me is clear, and it's clear to anybody that looks at it with the kinds of sense that I'm talking about.
Hiroyo, might you have some sensibilities about this as well from your perspective? Hiroyo, I cannot, there she is, very good.
Sorry, the technical. Thank you for having me here today. Like Bruce said, it's simply the nuclear weapons should not be used. It cannot be used. It's very simple. All lives precious, and every precious life should be cared with our own beliefs. And we as Religions for Peace have been working based on this cherish our lives each lives, not only human beings, but all lives on this planet. And we've been working for that nuclear abolishment since the beginning of the Religions for Peace from 1970. And we have to keep doing this forever to the future, for the future generations. That's it.
Yeah. And that's so very important. And Arroyo, please speak, if you can, to the matter of what Renee has mentioned earlier, the Hibakusha, and the language that they speak, the admonitions that they give to us around the world about the scourge of these nuclear weapons and the atrocities wrought on them, the survivors, and their children in this present moment. Ureyo-san.
Yes, thank you so much. As I interacted with atomic bomb survivors, Hibakusha, always very touching to hear all the testimonies they tell us. It's very, hard to hear sometimes, and see the images that they have experienced and share with us. It's very hard to look at directly, but it is also important to see it and hear it from Hibakusha, because the number of Hibakusha is decline because of their ages, and now, always now is the moment to hear what is really happened with their voices. And like the slideshow we've seen earlier today is very touching as well. And we can see how they had, that children had ideas of their future, and really it's very touching experience. And we as a organization should create that opportunity as much as possible to spread those Hibakusha voices to the public, to the communities in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and Renee, might you, what are your touch points, sitting there in your more geopolitical context, and perhaps where might the touch points be from communities of faith who predicate themselves on the spirit-filled life and caring for humanity out of basic humanitarian impulse?
Thanks, Mel. That's a good question. For us bureaucrats, it's always a little bit difficult to talk about morality and spirituality. It's not really what we're bred to do over on the other side of First Avenue. So when we think about these questions, we sort of look to our guiding documents, which first and foremost is the Charter of the United Nations. The United Nations is fundamentally, at the heart of it, a peace organization. As it says in the preamble to the Charter, it was founded to prevent the scourge of war. It's in that context that we also look at disarmament. Now, for disarmament specifically, there's sort of two rationales, I think, both of which have already been popped up in discussion here and also in the chat. The first is from the Charter itself. The Charter says that there should be the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources, which is a fancy way of saying, we have better things to spend our money on than weapons, and especially weapons of mass destruction. And the other reasoning comes from what we here refer to as SSOD1, the first special session of the General Assembly on disarmament, which referred to the threat to the very survival of mankind posed by the existence of nuclear weapons and the continuing arms race, and expressed the conviction that disarmament and arms limitation, particularly in the nuclear field, are essential for the prevention of the danger of nuclear war. So, you know, this idea that WMD and especially nuclear weapons pose this sort of completely unique sui generis danger to humankind and therefore have to be dealt with. In my speech, I touched on the concept of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the increased engagement with states. And for me, that's really, it was not only sort of a voyage of scientific discovery of the scientific effects of nuclear weapons, it was also taking nuclear weapons from this sort of accounting problem that it had been during the Cold War, where we looked at, you know, who has how many warheads, how many times can they destroy the world over, to really humanizing the impact and coming to grips with what does a nuclear weapons explosion actually entail, what would the impact be. And, you know, Hiroyo has spoken quite eloquently about the testimony of the Hibakusha, and they have had a profound impact also on the work of the UN on these multilateral negotiations that take place here. Hibakusha often come to speak at disarmament venues. I mentioned the NPT, I mentioned the TPNW. There's also regular annual meetings of the GA that deal with disarmament. And it's, you know, part of the mission of ODA, as we see it, is also to make sure that these testimonies are preserved and carried forward to future generations.
Thank you so much. And Karen, so much of where we might, you know, rest on the humanitarian issues, we act in this world, and how might you guide us through the panel to understand that better?
Well, it's such, as I said before, it's such a pleasure to be with all of you, even though it's such an unpleasant topic to be talking about. But most of my professional life has been trying to influence policy change. And so I've had a lot of experience with different kinds of education and civic action and grassroots organizing and so forth. But I wonder how each of you see the most effective way that we can bring about change. Is it possible to totally disarm and destroy all of the existing nuclear weapons? And if it is, how do we bring about that change? What is the civic action that we could encourage people in all countries to take to bring about the change that you've all talked about so eloquently? And I don't know which of you would like to go first. Bruce?
I'd be happy to take that on. Prior to this job, I was a US diplomat for 25 years. And one answer to your question is that we need some serious diplomacy. And we need serious diplomacy from nuclear weapons possessing states. And, you know, I've sit across the street from the UN. I watch it all the time. And certainly the countries that fought for TPNW and worked very hard to get that passed, they are very serious about abolishing nuclear weapons. But there has not been a serious initiative from any of the nuclear weapons possessing states to really do that. And it's going to take the United States and Britain and France and Russia to really get together and say, you know, these weapons are not in our future interests. And the threat of nuclear war grows over time. The other thing that I talk about a lot is, as American citizens or as the citizens of any country, we have our list of priorities, what we care about. We just had a national election here in the United States, and I don't remember any of the candidates being asked their position on nuclear weapons and how much money we should be spending on nuclear weapons. I don't remember this being brought up to any of the presidential candidates, any of the congressional candidates, any of the senatorial candidates. And unless we start asking them questions and then voting based on their answers, we're not going to get change in this government on nuclear weapons. So we've got to ask our members of Congress and our president and our senators what their position is. And if their position is that we want to continue the way things are, then we can't vote for them. It needs to be that, it has to be that high on our list of priorities that determines our vote. That if the president or the candidates for Congress or Senate won't abolish nuclear weapons or won't stop funding nuclear weapons, that we're not going to vote for that person.
Well, that's pretty profound, pretty strong, pretty unambiguous. And there were moments there, Bruce, when I thought maybe we're sharing a brain, that if we're going to change policy, and if we can't influence the current policymakers, then we maybe need to change the policymakers. But that's a difficult task, and it's not the #1 issue for most people. And so I wonder if any of you, and Renee, your work through the UN, if you have ideas on how to help more people throughout the world understand what you just talked about, Bruce. What are the mechanisms? How do we get people's attention to this when there's so many other issues to pay attention to, especially in this year of COVID? But I don't know, Hiroa or Renee, if you want to go next with your ideas on how to bring about change.
Well, maybe I'll go and I'll highlight, there's obviously many things to do. One thing that I would highlight is the importance of what we at the UN call disarmament education. I think, to be able to make a change, you first have to know about the topic. And I think there'll be a slide later with some resources. And because here at the Office for Disarmament Affairs, we've put together a disarmament education dashboard, which sort of contains courses, both self-guided and instructor-led, that you can use to educate yourself. And there's also resources for learning, which is aimed more at educators who want to incorporate that sort of thing into their lesson plans. There's lessons plans, there's presentations, there's all sorts of things that you can use. And since I'm doing a bit of propaganda for our products here, I'll mention, for any of the young people in the audience today, that the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs also has a #YouthForDisarmament initiative. Links to that will also be shown. And there's two things that especially point people's attention to. The first one is a video challenge called What If Spes which is closing on the 12th of August. And it asks people to imagine a world without WMD, weapons of mass destruction, that is. And the other one is a #StepUpForDisarmament challenge, which is aimed at marking the International Day Against Nuclear Tests on the 29th of August, where people can run or walk 8.29 kilometers to raise awareness about nuclear tests. Talking of the nuclear tests, I think talking of international days, I think, it's important to have sort of hooks to grab people's attention and point them about the importance to the importance of this topic. And there's two that I'd like to highlight. One is the International Day Against Nuclear Tests on the 29th of August. And there's also the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons on the 26th of September. So the UN will be doing some things around those days, but it's everyone's International Day. You should feel free to use that as an opportunity to hold an event or somehow use that to your advantage to raise awareness.
Thank you so much. And all of these resources will be in the chat, but also can be circulated after this session to all of the participants, as well as those who signed up but couldn't join us. So I am so glad that this is being recorded so that the people who aren't with us, and that's, you know, most of the world, they will be able to have access to this information. So Hiro, do you have something that you'd like to add from what you have learned in Japan that you wish that people in other countries would be able to understand?
Okay, thank you. I think it's what I'm trying to talk now is very close to what you have just said, Bruce and Renee, but it's very important and effective advocacy is providing information that makes people to get interested in and makes them want to know about it, about the nuclear disarmament. And one of the things Religions for Peace Japan is doing is running SNS like Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And as an organization, we can provide many reliable information as much as possible, and the individual can spread them and make more others to know about the nuclear weapon issues. So that's like which country has ratified to TPNW, or which senator is favor of the treaty, or what religious leaders says about the nuclear issues. Such information can be provided through the SNS. And we also try to make difficult issues like nuclear disarmament into very simple way, as simple as possible. Not everyone is an expert on nuclear issues, so using simple message and eye-catching images is very important. It's just the first step for building nuclear weapon-free world. So we want to keep the door wide open to everybody. That's what we do.
May I add one more thing, Karen, if you don't mind?
Please.
The other thing is to talk to our members of Congress. And let me highlight Guy Quinlan is a member of All Souls Church here in New York City. And our member of Congress here in the Upper East Side of New York is Carolyn Maloney. And he called her up and made an appointment and talked to her about a bill that was before Congress that was going to authorize more money for nuclear weapons. And he talked to her and said, I want you to vote against it. And she said, you know, I don't even know about this bill. I didn't even know this was on the agenda. And you've convinced me. And she did vote against it. The bill passed anyway, but at least our member of Congress didn't vote for it. And that personal intervention is something most of us are afraid to do, but it can be very effective if we do it.
I want to thank you for that, Bruce. And as I think of, from my own personal experience, the kinds of actions that bring about change, it starts with education. It starts with, as you have all said, most people are not aware of the issues surrounding nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. So we need to educate people. And then we need to advocate. We need to talk with the people who are passing the laws, as the example that Bruce just gave. And if that doesn't work, then we need to throw the rascals out. We need to, but that takes a great deal of organizing, all three of those pieces. And it takes people like you who are committed to this to first to educate. And then once people are informed, they will be able to know who their elected officials are, and they can set up meetings or send letters. And if that doesn't work, what I call extreme advocacy is we get involved in the elections. So I thank you, Bruce, and excuse me for taking up some of your all time, but I wonder if there's anything else that any of you would like to add to that. But I also want to say to the participants that we can submit your questions in the Q&A, and in another dozen minutes or so, 10, 12 minutes, we will be addressing those questions. And so you could submit those questions to any of the individuals on the panel or to the entire panel. So before we have the Q&A time, are there other comments that any of you would like to make?
Yeah, I'd like to throw out another issue area here. There's a major ecosystem, a lot of industries that intersect with this matter of nuclear weapons. I mean, nuclear energy has its spent fuel, and that spent fuel is used oftentimes for small arms manufacturing. So, you know, what is the supply chain for that? I think that needs to be explored, because there are so many people in our communities worldwide, but let's just talk about the United States in this instance, who participate in those industries, but might not be aware of the implications of their work and how it affects other people's and the collateral damage that's done implicated by nuclear weapons. We often speak of weapons of mass destruction, but there are small arms that are used as well. So there are issues in this case of the First Nations people and how they were affected. We can say that in Niger and in Chad, you know, we can talk about the downwinders. There are many areas that are affected. And so in our advocacy work, I wonder how you might think of engaging others who might be unaware of their participation in the nuclear weapons franchises, unbeknownst to them.
I mean, I'll just mention in this context that this is an area where I think civil society at the international level has had and continues to have a very big impact. First, for landmines and cluster munitions, and now for nuclear weapons, there are civil society projects to encourage financial institutions to stop their funding of nuclear weapons related work. So in the nuclear weapons sphere, it's a project that's called Don't Bank on the Bomb. And it's really, you know, as you said, it's highlighting to these financial institutions the sort of work that the companies they invest in do, and urging them to stop that funding. And in all those cases, you know, the civil society campaigns draw on the treaties in question. So the TPNW in the nuclear sphere, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and so on. Those treaties, you don't explicitly prohibit that sort of financing, but you know, they can be used to say, well, look, here's the international community having made a statement about you know, the legality and morality of these weapons. Perhaps you shouldn't invest in them.
The area of socially responsible investing is a huge growth industry. The UUA's pension fund, which is a large pension fund, and it's like many church pension funds, is invested in areas that are consistent with our values. And there are companies that will help you do that. You can go to a company and say, I want to invest my money, and here's what I believe in. And I don't want my money to go to these other things like nuclear waste or weapons or any of that. I want my money to go in things that are positive. And they will give you a portfolio that will make you money. You will get good returns from your investment, but they won't go to anything that you don't believe in or want to support. And I strongly suggest anybody that's responsible for investing your own money or an institution's money to invest according to your values.
Wise counsel, good advice. Well, if there are additional comments in relation to the kind of civic action, education, and advocacy? If not, we might be able to just transition into the questions and answers because there are quite a few of questions already. And there's.
Can I add one thing, one information?
Yes, please.
To the audience. In Japan, there is a website that shows the political position of all Japanese members of parliament and to the TPNW. If so, someone said the person you voted doesn't know what their position is towards the nuclear weapons, but there is a website in Japan that shows the numbers, which all the members of parliament, how they stand their policy, that their stance for the nuclear weapons. So if that, the same thing can happen to the United States and other countries as well, so people can see clearly the person you voted for has how they see the vision towards the nuclear weapons. It's only in Japanese, so even if I share the links to the chat box, I don't know if you can read it, but do you think should I do it?
Well, thank you for that comment because it's totally relevant, and there are similar programs in the United States. I don't know about other countries, but there are civil society organizations that keep track of this information and make it public. But maybe Renee knows how other countries are handling that issue. No, but there is a question for you. Okay.
I was going to say that it always kind of baffled me that Japan, I don't believe, signed the TPNW. And I know even like Holland, for example, the Netherlands is another country that I think was inclined to sign it and didn't. And there was tremendous pressure from the United States government on all of our allies, Canada, all of our allies that might have signed the TPNW not to do so. And, you know, I don't know what Russia and China did, but certainly the United States put a lot of pressure on our allies not to sign. And I know there were countries like Japan and the Netherlands and maybe some others that were inclined to sign, but didn't do so because of the pressure that was put on them.
Renee, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A box that have to do with the economics of the issue. And I know that each of you, Bruce and Arroyo, could weigh in on this as well. One of the comments made was whether or not the issue of nuclear weapons, given the TPNW and the ZIF, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and its entry into force, excuse me for the acronym, would have been brought up at the G20 or the World Economic Forum. Has there been any discussion about that and its implications for nuclear weapons abolition?
You know, I'm not aware of discussion specifically about nuclear weapons abolition in those forums. But I will say that the sort of broader topic, which we at the UN call reduction in military expenditures, has been with the UN since the beginning. You know, here at the UN, one of the ways that we study a topic further is to appoint groups of governmental experts, and there have been several going back, you know, over half a century that have looked into the question of the reduction in military expenditure. There's also periodic resolutions in the General Assembly on the link between disarmament and development. The idea that money that rich countries don't spend on armaments could be spent on sustainable development. So while I'm not sure that those forums have specifically engaged with it, these are certainly questions that the UN has grappled with. And especially in light of the pandemic that we've just lived through, I've noticed in the discourse amongst diplomats a return to this thinking that we have limited resources, we should spend it on development, pandemic preparedness, global health, rather than disarmament. And while nowadays, not so much 50 years ago, but nowadays this question of reduction in military spending tends to be looked at from a view of conventional arms. In my view, nuclear weapons, WMD expenditure has to be a part of that, because as we've discussed earlier, it's for those countries that possess nuclear weapons, it's a tremendous chunk of expenditure that gets used on that.
Yeah, I see another set of questions, and I'm hoping I'm relating Mr. Elmendorf's question with Ms. Camilla's question about looking at steps. There's a focus on South Africa and Libya having given up their nuclear ambitions. I think the Treaty of Pelindaba in South Africa, they were actually developing weapons and decided to release themselves from that tyranny, if you will. And Ed asks if we can look at a focus on the nuclear weapons holding states to just left me to look. He's asking if the panelists would look at that. I think some of that may have been approached, but Ed is a very practiced diplomat himself. Comment on the endeavor to move ahead with smaller steps instead of trying to focus on the ultimate goal, the incremental approach. What are some of your thoughts about incrementalism in this approach to NWA?
Yeah, I think that we should take whatever steps that we can take. And if we can't take big steps, then take small steps. One small step that we should take immediately is declare a no first use policy, declare that the United States will not be the first country to use nuclear weapons. And that should be our policy anyway. That's consistent with our morality. Ed also mentioned about China. And satellite photography seems to be indicating that China is working on its nuclear weapons. Russia and the United States have the largest arsenals. China's arsenal is quite a bit smaller. It may be trying to catch up, or at least bring it forward. The United States and Russia are both upgrading their arsenals and spending a tremendous amount of money to make the weapons deadlier and smaller and more lethal than they were before. So a lot of money in these three countries, Russia, China, and the United States, are going into upgrading or enhancing their nuclear arsenal at a time when we need money for the pandemic, we need money for development, so the issue of money is paramount, and we should bring pressure. But getting countries to at least say we will not be the first to use nuclear weapons is, to me, an easy first step, but nobody's been willing to take it so far.
And Beth Akiyama just put in the chat that she would be supportive of that by focusing our energies on Congress with no first use. I might say I was just in New London, Connecticut, and the discussion there was about major contracting to build more nuclear submarines by this government.
Yeah.
So
Renee, you have your hand raised. Do you want to add to the conversation, Renee? But you're muted.
So I just wanted to chip in on the question of South Africa and Libya, and mention that South Africa has indeed been, since it gave up its nuclear weapons program, a great advocate for nuclear disarmament, one of the leading advocates for the treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons, but also extremely active in other nuclear disarmament contexts. That said, I think we have to also sort of put its own, the South African experience into context a little bit. I think by the time that they decided to dismantle their nuclear weapon, they had something in the neighborhood of 5 warheads assembled, which, of course, the arsenals of any of the states that possess nuclear weapons today are significantly larger than that. On the question of sort of incrementalism or going the whole hog, this is a question that's also very much alive, or debate, I should say, that's very much alive among states. From about, just after the negotiation of the NPT in 1968 until just a couple of years ago, the idea was that we should take the step-by-step approach, that the way we get to nuclear disarmament is, well, first we'll ban maybe nuclear tests through the CTBT, which was adopted but hasn't entered into force, and then maybe we'll prohibit the production of fissile material, and their states haven't even gotten around to the negotiations yet. And through these incremental steps, we would get to the end. And the states that drove the negotiation that led to the TPNW really became frustrated with that, not because they were frustrated by taking little steps, but they were frustrated by talking about little steps that were never actually taken. And they took the view that we need, the way we've done it with all the other WMDs are, we prohibit the thing first, and then we get rid of them. So the first step is to prohibit, and then we take steps to get rid of it. Here at the UNODA, we are, and forgive me, in religious company, we're sort of agnostic about which approach to take. We say the great thing about multilateralism is that many approaches can be used at the same time to achieve a common goal. But we would say that for a step-by-step approach, we really must be actually taking the steps to move us closer to that goal.
Two other countries that I wanted to lift up too are Ukraine and Kazakhstan, both former Soviet republics. And as soon as they got their independence, they gave up their nuclear weapons. I've been to the mission of Kazakhstan to the UN several times and talked to the ambassador and to other diplomats there. And part of the reason they gave up nuclear weapons and then actually declared and got all of their neighbors in Central Asia to declare that whole region a nuclear-free zone is because in the Soviet Union, they used to test nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan. And so there are people there that are suffering from radiation poisoning and from injury. And so they have a personal experience with nuclear weapons, and it's why they wanted to get rid of them in their country and also get their neighbors to agree to that as well.
Excellent addition to the conversation. Thank you. And the idea of the no first use of nuclear weapons is not a new one. It's one of the coalitions that I coordinated back in the 80s was to get organizations to encourage Congress to pass legislation that said we will not use nuclear weapons first. And I think everyone on the panel thinks that we probably shouldn't use them second either. So why have them? But that's not going to be something that's going to be easy for elected officials in the United States to do. And it's not going to happen unless there is a serious effort to have as many people as possible expressing that point of view to the elected officials. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're getting tickled about the Q&A period where we couldn't get to all of the questions. There are many remarkable ones. Tom, I think your question was really important. Miss Camilla has a series of questions, and I think if we can look to the building of this community, that we can develop relationships with one another so that we can further explore not only these underpinnings, we talked about the moral issues and the discussion about that, but also how we can build broader coalitions of both individuals and organizations to pressure the policymakers, as Karen reminds us so frequently. So with that, I think we might look to, in the interest of our time here, for the summing up and the closing remarks. And I just delight in being able to get myself further educated and knowing full well that there is so much more of my education to do. And I thank you all for being here.
Yes, I want to join Mel in thanking you for spending this time with us, especially if you had to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning in Japan to be with us. So this has been extremely informative. And as I said before, I'm glad it's been recorded so that people who missed it tonight can, or this morning, wherever you are, whatever time zone, that you can, they can see it later. So I don't know if anyone wants to make a final remark, or if we should really move on to the closing.
Well, with that, Chuck, might you join us in helping us to gather what we've heard and what we might think are next steps?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all. Yeah, on behalf of the UNA-NCA and All Souls Church, I want to express my gratitude for the speakers, the panelists, the organizers, the UNA-NCA staff, and all of you who've joined us this evening for this event during the week where we sadly commemorate the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombings. The plaque at the cenotaph on the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park reads, "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat this evil." And I think we're all here asking ourselves, well, what are we called to do, or what are we compelled to do? First, I think if we can imagine a nuclear weapons-free world, that is the beginning, and then we have to commit to take some action. And that is why there can be a reason for hope. I think we've heard tonight about the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, along with the messages of our speakers and panelists. And I think this all gives us hope. And each one of us can do something. And in this connection, I invite you all to join in one of the other upcoming events that will be shared on a slide with you. So there are a number of events even the rest of this week. If we can share the slide, if it can come up. Yeah, so there are a number of events taking place the rest of this week, marking this solemn occasion. And I think each of us, to use those events as a chance to reflect on what our own particular actions can be in this. And also to equip you to take some action. You will be receiving a list of advocacy-related resources in conjunction with a post-event UNA-NCA survey. And we hope to release a post-event summary as soon as possible. So again, I thank you kindly for having devoted a bit of time to think about this very grave global issue of nuclear disarmament. And I would leave us all with a very one of my favorite quotes by John F. Kennedy Jr. And I think it's very appropriate today. And he said, "Peace is a daily, a weekly, a monthly process, gradually changing opinions, eroding old barriers, and quietly building new structures." So as we like to say at All Souls, go in peace.